Much of the book of Daniel counts as apocalyptic literature, although, as we will see, not all of it does. Unlike, for example, the books of Enoch, Daniel is not here a figure from the distant past, but somebody who himself lives in exile. It is probably partly for this reason that in Christian tradition he is included among the prophetic works. There seem to be two major sections in the book of Daniel. Chapters 1 through 6 are third-person narratives about Daniel and his three companions. Their stories they refer to the Babylonian and Persian periods, the 6th through the 5th centuries BCE. Chapters 7 through 12 include 4 visions. These are in the first person, which are explained by an angel, and some think it is about events in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BCE. There are some historical questions that arise in the book. First of all, the text depicts Daniel as being deported from Jerusalem in about 607 BCE, the 3rd year of Jehoiakim the king, but the other biblical texts do not specifically mention deportation at that time. However, both in the Bible and in the Babylonian Chronicle from Babylon, it seems that Nebuchadnezzar does invade Judah a number of times, including during Jehoiakim's reign. And it's possible that some people would have been carried off to serve the king in Babylon. In Daniel 5:11, Belshazzar is called implicitly the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And in 7:1, he appears as king of Babylon. One question that arises is the fact that we have other accounts in which the last Chaldean or Babylonian king, Nabonidus, entrusted the kingship in 539 BCE to his son Belshazzar. This is the Akkadian equivalent to Belshazzar. So in a sense, Belshazzar then is not king per se, but sort of a regent for the king, while Nabonidus was absent from Babylon. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, makes Nabonidus the son of Nebuchadnezzar. So in that case, Belshazzar is the son of Nebuchadnezzar in the sense that he is a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. Sometimes the word son can be used in that sense. Chapter 531 talks about Belshazzar being conquered by Darius the Mede. But what we find in other historical records is only a Darius as Persian, related to Artaxerxes, in other words, Darius the First, the 3rd king of the Achaemenid Empire. So that is a question. If Darius in chapter 6 is Darius the First, which would be in the last quarter of the 6th century, 522 to 486, then Daniel would be very old, and some have brought this up. We do find that the Greek historians Herodotus and Xenophon report that Babylon was conquered during a feast, as in chapter 5. Well, where Belshazzar is having a feast and is conquered. Eusebius of Caesarea, one of the church fathers, records reports of the madness of Nebuchadnezzar, elsewhere attributed to Nabonidus, as we see in the stories in Daniel. There are all sorts of questions that have been raised about when the book was written. And keep in mind, there could be differences in when events take place in a book and when they are actually written down into the final form of the biblical book. One issue is that the language is post-exilic, and it uses Akkadian, some Greek, and Persian terms. And of course, we find references to Persian kings in Daniel as well. Chapters 2 through 7 are mostly in what is called Imperial Aramaic. This would have been the Aramaic used during the time of the Persian Empire. And if some of the parts of Daniel had been written during the Babylonian period, some expect an earlier form of Aramaic. But of course, the stories could have been written at a later time, recalling events in the past. Some see concepts in Daniel to be later than most of what we find in biblical thought. For example, if Daniel and his friends are vegetarians because of kosher laws, then kosher laws seem to come more from the Pharisaic period. However, there could be other reasons for Daniel and the friends avoiding meat in a Babylonian context. Praying toward Jerusalem is generally found in later texts, the way that angels are described, and the concept of the resurrection in chapter 12, verse 2, does not seem to be found in the rest of the biblical books. However, all of that aside, the first part of the book seems to look back on the exile, and most other apocalyptic literature is later. We do find that the book of Daniel was exceedingly important at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this has, this is witnessed by the fact that a number of different fragments from different manuscripts have been found at Qumran. Parts of the book seem to be familiar with the events of the Maccabean Revolt in the 2nd century, including the 2 military campaigns by Antiochus IV against Egypt in 170 and 169, and the repression of Jewish worship. Some have suggested, say, chapter 7 and chapter 11 here. 8:14 seems to refer to the purification of the temple in 165, and the book does not know of the death of Antiochus between 168 and 164, if indeed this is what is being referred to in 1140. Another aspect of the book is that in part 1, the attitude towards Gentiles is only moderately hostile, and then only when the Gentiles require turning away from the worship of the one true God. Part 2 of the book of Daniel has much more hostility towards the Gentiles, and many scholars date the second half of the book to the time of the Maccabees in the 2nd century BCE.